Let's go. Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the fourth round here of the Qatar Masters being played in Doha. Now, in round number 4, we have Magnus Carlsen trying to regroup. He lost in a shock second round upset. He won yesterday. Today, he's playing against another very talented Indian junior player, M. Pranesh. Now, M. Pranesh is someone that I'm very familiar with. He goes by the username of R2 on chess.com. I've played against him many games. There probably are some videos on our channel of games I've played against him. But what I remember from all of the games that I've had are that Pranesh is somebody who is a lunatic. He loves to sacrifice material, whether it's pawns, whether it's pieces. He's very tactical and very, very aggressive. So let's see if Magnus would understand this and try to avoid a tactical skirmish against a talented Indian junior. All right, so the game starts with the move e4, and now Magnus decides to play g6. We get d4, d6, knight c3, and c6. Now, this, of course, is a classic modern system. Black gives up a lot of space in the center of the board, but tries to play it with some hyper-modern ideas like bishop g7, maybe b5, maybe pressure with b4, knight f6, generally trying to attack this big white center. So Pranesh plays bishop e3. We get knight to f6. We have f3. b5 played here by Magnus. Now, one fun tidbit is that this is a system that my stepfather actually taught me when I was very young. It's a system that he's actually played his whole life. This modern with d6, g6, c6, and b5. Nowadays, one of the main setups generally is black tries to play a6 and b5. This is what is known as the tiger modern, where black tries to go for the double fianchetto this way and keep this diagonal open. But c6 is also playable as well. So we get g4. Magnus plays h5. We have g5, knight fd7. And on first glance, you're thinking, wait a second. Black should be fine now because the king side is closed, so he can go bishop g7 and castle the king out of the center of the board without getting attacked on the king side. So here we get f4 from Pranesh. Very, very aggressive move, fitting in with the style of play that we've seen online. We get knight b6, knight f3, and here Magnus plays b4. We get knight to e2, and now Magnus plays d5 here, sort of combining a lot of different systems. What Magnus is trying to do by playing d5 is clog the toilet, as we like to say. He's trying to close the king side of the board here so that white can never attack. So Pranesh plays e5, and now Magnus goes bishop g4. We get bishop to g2. He plays e6. And now, first of all, Magnus has the classic flying V formation, but much more importantly, the king side is completely closed. White cannot really push f5 here. The pawn will be captured. You have nothing on the h file or the g file. So Magnus has achieved what he wanted, which is a very slow, very blocked position where it's going to come down to positional maneuvering. So here we get h3. Magnus trades the bishop, of course, because now he's gotten rid of this bad light square bishop. Now the pawn structure makes a lot of sense here. For example, if Magnus were to play, say, e6 here, it's really questionable where this bishop is going. You can always go to a6, but it's not doing a whole lot. So we get bishop f3, knight d7 played by Magnus. Not sure why it's saying this is a mistake. It seems completely fine. But the computer does want knight c4, bishop c1, and c5 to put the knight on c6 and try to put a lot of pressure on these pawns on d4 and e5. So we get knight d7. Pranesh plays h4 here. Magnus goes bishop e7. We get castles. Rook c8 here. And now we have c3 being played by Pranesh, trying to build the connect 5. Magnus plays knight c4. We get bishop to c1, retreating the bishop to guard the pawn on b2. And now Magnus trades on c3 and goes rook b8. Now, it looks like Magnus has gotten everything and then some. He's got a great bastion with this knight on c4. He's got control of the open file. And most importantly, his king will be able to castle down the road. And there's very little danger due to the flying v formation. So here we get king h1 from Pranesh. Magnus goes queen to a5. And now we have this move queen d3. Now, one thing that you'll notice is that when positions are very complex and there aren't obvious straightforward moves, generally you will see a lot of mistakes, whether they're serious mistakes or only minor errors. In general, the more complicated that a game is with less obvious decisions, you will see more mistakes from both players, which is why you do have to be very careful when you use the accuracy tool on chess.com, because there are many games where you might have 20 moves that are very straightforward, very easy to play, and then you have a game like this one where almost every move for both sides is not clear-cut at all. So Magnus goes bishop a3 here. We get bishop to e3 from Pranesh. Magnus trades the knight for the bishop. Now, this is a decision that I really don't like from Magnus just in general, because this dark square bishop is locked behind this pawn wall. So even if white were to get the bishop to g1, where is this bishop going? The pawn is in the way. You've got all these pawns. Bishop simply has no scope. So a bishop with no scope is generally what we call a big pawn. Instead, Magnus trades his great knight, this bastion on c4, away for a bad dark square bishop that white has. and now we get knight to b6. Pranesh plays rook a b1, trying to contest this b file. Now Magnus goes king d7, and here Pranesh sacrifices multiple pawns here with this great move, pawn to f5. Now in this position, Magnus looks to be doing very, very well. He wants to go knight c4, maybe bishop b2, play on the queen side of the board. But what Pranesh realizes with f5 is that in this position, his knight has no oxygen. There really are no good squares for the knight to go to. So when he plays f5, now the position starts to open up for the knight and the bishop. Magnus captures with the e-pawn. If he were to take the g-pawn here after knight to f4, white is trying to win this pawn on h5 and then hit the pawn on f7, which is the base of the chain. So Magnus takes with the e-pawn, Pranesh goes e6, sacrificing a second pawn, but now this knight is jumping all over the board, and there are forks, and there was a lot of pressure on black's pawns. So here Magnus plays rook h8. Now this is around the first time that I stopped to see Magnus's board and see what was going on, and looking at Magnus's general reaction, he looked a little bit disheveled, he looked a little bit tired, and I could tell that he was very worried about the position. So he plays rook h8, and here Pranesh does not fall victim to what we call the classic Magnus effect. He plays this great move, bishop to e2, which takes away the bastion with knight to c4, all the while keeping a lot of pressure on these two pawns on e6 and g6. So here we get bishop to d6 being played by Magnus, and now Pranesh takes on g6, and Magnus goes knight c4, because here he has to do something. If he were to play, say, a move like rook b7, for example, white can go knight to e5, black trades the bishop for the knight. Pawn on h5 is weak. White's trying to push the g-pawn up the board, and it's very, very hard for black to play because even though black has more material here, the b file is open, white's pushing g6, the king is very safe on h1, and without any breaks in the center activity for the knight, all of white's pieces are placed better than black's pieces. So we get knight c4, Pranesh trades the bishop for the knight, and now he plays knight to e5. An excellent move here, because what Pranesh realizes is that this black king, it looked very safe a couple of moves ago. If you go back to this point, the king looks really safe in the center of the board. All these pawns, bishop in front of the king. But now what's happening here after knight to e5 is the position is opening up, and it's very likely we're going to have multiple open files for white to attack on. So Magnus plays king c7 here, and now Pranesh plays knight f7. Now, what I suspect, I don't know who's in this position, whether it was here or a few moves earlier, is I think Magnus miscalculated a very basic tactic after knight f7, which is I think when Magnus played queen d5, we got king g1 and f4, queen f2. I think Magnus probably, whether it was here or a few moves before, probably thought that he could trade the rooks on b1 and go queen to f5, hitting the rook on b1 and the knight on f7. And you're thinking, wow, I mean, white should be doing great, or black should be doing great. If you go queen b2 to guard the rook and go for checkmate, now there's queen g4 check. I guess this is also apparently only a draw, but nonetheless, black is fine. But the problem with queen f5 is that white can sack the rook with rook to b7, checking the king here, and black gets family forked, because after king c8, there's knight takes bishop, forking the king, the rook, and the queen. And if you take the rook after knight takes d6, once again, I'm forking the king, the queen, and the rook, and I'm winning the game. So I suspect that Magnus missed this tactic because somewhere around here, I think I want to say in this position maybe, or maybe it was after king g1, he used a lot of time for the next couple of moves. So we get f4, queen f2, Magnus trades the rooks on b1, and now goes rook to f8. And here Pranesh plays queen b2, sacrificing the horse on f7, and going for the checkmate with queen b7. Here Magnus plays c5, only move, by the way, most of these moves only moves for both sides, but specifically for Magnus. He makes one wrong move, he's going to lose the game, and we're going to have a whole new set of raging. So after c5, we get knight takes d6. Magnus takes with the king. Pranesh goes queen a3, trying to infiltrate with the queen, check the king, or maybe take one of these two pawns on a7 or c5. Magnus plays queen to f5 here, and this is apparently a big mistake. Now, it's hard to fault Magnus, because computer wants this very weird move, rook to a8, simply guarding the pawn on a7, but here, black's king is getting attacked very viciously after, like, queen a6, for example, and going king c7 feels very, very iffy. So I don't fault Magnus. Queen f5 looks like an obvious move here to try and create counterplay with the check and to hit the rook on b1 at the same time. You get queen to a6 check, king d5 played by Magnus. Only move here if you were to go king e7. There's rook b7 check, and after king d8, queen d6, king is getting checkmated on e7 or on c7. So we get king d5. Magnus is king in the center of the board, but there is no knockout blow because his pawn on a7 covers the b6 square. We get queen b7, king d6. White would love to go rook b6, but that would simply lose the game. So here, Pranesh decides to take on c5, which is a good decision. He could have also forced a draw by repetition, checking back and forth. But one thing that's great about these young kids is that they have no fear. They have not lost to Magnus. They haven't been swindled. There's none of this memory that all the top players, I should say, have from losing to Magnus so many times. So these kids are fearless, and they have no fear of just a random world champion like Magnus Carlsen. And why should they? They've never lost him. So I mean, what's the fear? As the old saying goes, you have nothing to fear but fear itself. So, after king to d6, Pranesh takes on c5. We get queen takes c5, king to d1, and now queen d5 played by Magnus. Only move again. All other moves lose here because white is threatening to go rook to d1. So you play a5, there's rook d1, king e5, and then queen g7 simply wins the rook and wins. Or actually, sorry. No, wait, I'm wrong. The queen guards here. Sorry, I'm mistaken. I think it's rook e1 and then queen e4. Maybe I'm wrong again. Wait a second. No, apparently not a5. Sorry, I was gonna try to. Let me just make a random move like queen a5. You go rook to d1, king e5, queen g7, winning the rook. And if black were to play a5, which is the line I just mentioned, there's rook b6 check, king e5, and rook b5, winning the queen on c5. So anyway, we got queen d5 here from Magnus, which covers the d1 square. You offer the trade of queens, but you also threaten to check on h1 as well. And this is what the famous streamer Felix Longdrell, also known as XQC, refers to as the sun ring. So here, after queen d5, we get queen b4, which is a mistake. After this move, white has thrown away any chance of winning the game. Now, the move that the computer wants here is queen a6, king c7, takes, king d6, queen b6, king d7, and now there's this move queen b7, trading the queens off the board. And apparently white is winning in this endgame. But to be honest, it's very hard to do this for a couple of reasons. That the flow of the game has been a game where Pranesh for the last 20 moves has been on the attack. He's trying to checkmate the black king, trying to trade off queens here and go into an endgame. It's very hard to do this because you've been attacking and suddenly you want to simplify. But also even beyond that, when we look at this position here after king d6, black has two connected pawns. So black is pushing p in the center of the board. And then the third problem is that, of course, the player with the black pieces is Magnus Carlsen, who's probably the best endgame player of all time. So why do you want to do this? Nonetheless, computer does think that this is winning if you let it go deep enough. Instead, Pranesh plays queen b4, and now Magnus sacks the rook with king to e5. We get rook e1, king f5, queen takes rook check, and now king g4. And after king to g4, if anybody is to be careful here, it's actually white, because black is trying to checkmate with the king and the queen. So one example, say you were to play a random move like, I don't know, queen b4, for example. I think after queen f3, king g1, oh, king h3 is actually queen b2. So maybe white doesn't have to be that careful. But if black could get king h3 here with the idea of the lolly checkmate with queen g2, it could be very scary. Now, in this situation, white has queen b2 to cover the square, but nonetheless, it feels very dangerous. So Pranesh plays rook e2 instead, and now we get f3 from Magnus, and here Pranesh plays queen f6. A couple of really, really good moves, because it's very easy here to see the boogeyman and be afraid of all kinds of checkmates here with this weak white king. But Pranesh played rook e2 fairly quickly, and then he played queen f6, which is another excellent move, sacking the rook back. Now, white has to sack the rook back, so if you play a move like rook e1, now after queen d3, king g1, and here queen to, I think, c2 to cover the e4 square, so there's no check. Black is actually completely winning because white can't really stop the checkmate on g2 without sacrificing a bunch of material. So Pranesh plays queen f6. Magnus has to take the rook now, because if you were to check and go queen d3, king g1, and queen c2, now white wins the game because you can take the pawn with check, and after king g3, there's queen to e5, king g4, and then you have queen e4 trading off the queens. So instead, Magnus decides to take the rook. We get king takes pawn, queen to e4 check, king f2. And here Magnus has to basically force a draw after e5, g6 with queen c2, because here white is going to be pushing p with g7, g8 queen, and black can't checkmate the white king, and so Magnus forces a draw. Here we get queen c2, king g1, queen b1, king g2, queen e4, king f2, and the game ends here. It would have ended with a repetition after queen c2, king g1, queen b1, king g2, and queen e4 again. Worth pointing out, queen takes a2 here would be a huge mistake, because after queen f2, offering the trade of the queens, black cannot trade the queens, because then white pushes the g-pawn and wins the game. And after a move like queen to a6, for example, now white can go queen f3 check, king h4, and queen g3, which checkmates the king on the edge of the board. So, a very exciting game that ends in a draw between Magnus Carlsen and M. Pranesh from India. I did do some commentary, or I did an interview after my game on my Kick channel, and one person I think has to be very, very proud after seeing this game, and honestly the games of all the Indian players in this tournament, and that player would be Vishy Anand. Now, to use an analogy, this, I know some people might not like a religious analogy, but I very much view it as Vishy Anand being Jesus, and all these young Indian kids, whether it's Nihal Sareen, Pragnananta, Gukesh, Pranesh, Buddy Pranav. I mean, the list goes on and on. It very much feels like it's Jesus and his disciples, and all these monster kids from India. Magnus might have beaten Vishy, but all these kids from India are going to be coming after him for the next 20 years or however long Magnus chooses to play chess, and it's going to be his worst nightmare. So it's going to be really exciting to see Magnus try to fend off all these Indian kids who are out for blood whenever they play him, and definitely to try and get some revenge for Anand, who lost to Magnus in the World Championship some years back. So, all right, that was Magnus's game, which ends in a draw. Magnus now is on 2.5 points out of 4. He's a little bit behind. There probably are 1 or 2 players on 4 out of 4. But let's move to my game now. So, in the 4th round, I'm playing against Robbie Kevlishvili, who represents the Netherlands. He is of Georgian origin, the country Georgia, to be clear. A very strong player who is good friends with one of the commentators on my channel, Benjamin Bach. So, in this game, I start with e4, and Robbie plays e5. Now, Robbie is normally a player who's played the Sicilian, so e5 was a mild surprise for me, but I still was somewhat ready. So we get knight f3, knight c6, and now I play bishop c4, essaying the classic Gucci piano once again. We have bishop c5, c3, knight f6, d3, d6, castles, and here we get a6. Now, as you might remember, 2 days ago when I played Daiqing Gren from China, he actually played the line with a5 instead of a6. And as I mentioned in my recap on day 2, I don't really understand what the huge differences are between these moves. It's just the computers say both are playable. A5 stops b4. Sometimes you want to go a6. But again, this is like 3,500 level 4D chess that I simply don't understand. Until someone can actually translate the computer evaluations and moves into a human language that we understand, there will be no rational explanation for why you play a5 or why you play a6 and what the differences are. But both moves are considered fine. So here Robbie plays a6. Now I play a4. Important move here, by the way, because if I don't play a4, say I go rook e1, black can play knight a5, and now black will swap this knight for the bishop. I don't have this check, and if I go back in this position, generally 2 bishops are better than a bishop and a knight. So here I play a4 to create the square for the bishop on a2, anticipating knight a5, but also later on I can play b4 and try to push p on the queen side, all the while taking more space. So you get castles, rook e1, bishop a7, h3, and here Robbie plays bishop e6. Now, this move is not a bad move by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not the line that I had looked at before the game. So when Robbie plays bishop e6 here, I trade the bishops, and now I play this move bishop e3. Now, b4 is considered the main line here, but I figured because my opponent is not somebody who normally plays e4, e5, perhaps I can catch him off guard. When you combine that with the fact that I very rarely play the Gucci piano, I thought it would make sense to try and avoid the absolute main lines. So I play bishop e3. Robbie trades the bishops instantly and plays d5. And right away, I'm very, very unhappy because even though I'm playing a player who is 350 points lower, or sorry, I should say 250 points lower rated because I can't do math. I'm very unhappy because the one advantage that the strong players have over the lower rated players is generally a better understanding. So if the players who are weaker can blitz out a lot of moves because they're using computers to prepare, it sort of neutralizes that advantage in a very significant way. So after d5, here I play knight d2. Robbie again plays d4 instantly, and now I trade the pawns on d4. Now, rook to e1 is a move that I did consider during the game. But because Robbie was moving so fast here, I figured he would trade, go queen d3, queen to b3, and play something like queen d6 or queen d7 here, and I wasn't really sure how to proceed. Now, apparently this is a big mistake because of knight c4, but it's already simplifying quite a bit, and I thought I would try to do something different to keep him on his heels. So I trade right away. I go rook e2, and now Robbie plays knight d7 nearly instantly. And again, I'm very, very unhappy because with every move that progresses, it means my opponent has one less tough decision to make in the game, and it means that the computers are just that effective at helping lower-rated players prepare, which is also why, to give one other little bit of commentary aside from the game, there was a tweet yesterday from Jan Nepomniachtchi where he was saying He basically was essentially saying either the rating system doesn't work, so the top players are not able to beat the lower rated players as much as they should be according to the rating system, or people are cheating. Now, obviously, everybody is not cheating, but it is very clear that due to preparation, the fact that it's much easier to prepare for games these days, the advantages of the top players are really being neutralized by the stockfishes of the world, and it's getting harder and harder to win games against lower rated players because they tend to be getting further into the game before they have to actually use their brain, and so they're playing like a 3500 for the first 20 moves, which means that they've already had to make 20 decisions essentially, but they haven't. So that is my little bit of sidebar commentary, but back to the game. Here after knight d7, I play queen b3. Again, Robbie plays queen e7. And already here, I'm just hoping that I'm not going to walk into anything major. So I go rook c1. Robbie plays knight a5, and now I play this move queen to a3, which is a mistake. Now, one of the reasons that I played queen a3 here was my opponent was moving very, very quickly, and I really wasn't sure what was going on after queen to a2 and c5. Now, I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out what was happening after b4, but after takes knight d4, initially I saw knight c5 to guard the pawn on e6, but here I have knight to f5, which due to the pin is close to winning here, because black can't just move the queen away without hanging this knight on c5, and after queen c7, I pin the tail on the donkey with d4, and I win this knight on c5, and with it I win the game. But as I realized, black can actually play this move rook a c8 here to trade the rooks off, and I was really unsure what's going on, because if I trade the rooks on c8, and say, for example, I play this move knight takes e6, I actually am in some trouble, I think, after queen f7 here due to this pin. Although I guess maybe d4 is... Computer says d4 is fine, but definitely felt a little bit scary trying to go into this line. Maybe I should have done it. But if I don't see that, and for example, the line I was considering, which is like rook c8, rook e1, and knight c5 here, I was quite concerned about my position because black is his passed pawn, the d3 pawn is weak, and knight f5 no longer has any effect because black can go queen f7, the rook guards the knight, and when I move this horse from the f5 square, I lose the pawn on f2, and I lose the game. So, I played queen a3 mainly to get my opponent out of preparation, but also because we're headed to an endgame. And even though I felt I was a little bit worse in this endgame with the double pawns on a4 and a3, I thought I would have pretty decent chances to equalize and not lose. Now, also, to point this out, one thing that I think that a lot of the lower-rated players, like players who are like 2,500, 2,550-ish, are not as good at are endgames as well. So I figured if I can get an endgame here against a player who seems pretty tactical, that should give me chances as well. So Robbie goes c5 here. Now, the big issue I have is that black has this big black center. The pawns are very compact, and I have these double pawns on the edge of the board, which are not very effective. Now, normally when you do get double pawns, one of the things you want to do is try to use an open file for your rooks. So I play rook to b1, we get rook a b8, and now I played this move e5 after a very long thing. Now, in this position, there were a couple other alternatives. One of them was knight to c4 here, trying to trade these knights and create the double stack on the b5. But I was actually very worried if black sacks a pawn here with b5 after takes d3, like rook, I guess rook e1 and c4, and black has these two pawns that are marching up the board, combined with a possible rook sacrifice on f3, say something like this, and knight e5 with c3 incoming. It feels very, very tricky to play. So I didn't really want to go knight c4, and knight b3 was the other line that I really was considering for a long time, but after takes and b5, rook e b2, c4, I simply wasn't sure what was going on. Now, I thought I could take and then maybe take on b5 and play a position like this, but I wasn't sure if I could ever win this, and I thought if anybody has a chance to win, it's probably black. So I figured it's a situation where if I play well, I draw the game. If I don't play well, I probably lose the game, but I don't see any chance to win the game. So I don't want a situation where it's a draw or a loss. I want a position where I keep chance to maybe win if my opponent makes a mistake. Now, the computer does think after king f1 here, rook bc8, for example, white can go king e2, and maybe white is better here, but it's very, very hard to judge without knowing the actual valuation. So, at the end of the day, I decided to play e5 instead. Here, I try not to trade the knight for knight on d2 for the knight on the rim. Instead, I want to go knight to e4 and pressure the pawn on c5. Now, in my opinion, this makes a lot of sense because one of the big issues here is if I could take this pawn on a3, there's no way to really set it up, but just to illustrate the point, is that if I could somehow undouble these pawns and put this pawn on b4, I could break this chain of 2 from c5 and b4. But the problem here is that I can't push b4 and break the chain. So I figured here, if I can't break this chain, how do I put pressure on it? And the only way to do that is to play e5 and knight e4 to pressure the pawn on c5. So here we get the move b5. I trade, go knight e4. Here, rook b6 is played. Now, I think this is a mistake. I think c4 would have been a better move. Robbie instead plays rook b6, and now after rook to c2, black suddenly has to be very careful here because suddenly both these pawns on c5 and b5 are very brittle. So we get c4, I take on c4, Robbie takes back the knight, and I go rook d1. Now, as soon as I reach this position, time is evened out. I'm up about 5 or 6 minutes, but I felt like there's no danger of me losing anymore. And now I was stunned when my opponent decided to sack the rook with rook takes knight on f3. Now, this is a horrible move. From Robbie. Robbie actually started to see the boogeyman. Now, what I mean by that is he started to see ghosts. And when I spoke to Robbie after the game, he simply thought that if he were to trade the knights on e5, that after rook takes d4, that he was in some danger. But as I pointed out to him after the game, after say knight c4, or even a move like h6, I don't really know where my big advantage is. Maybe there's some way, for example, just to illustrate this, where I can get some endgame where I end up a pawn with a 3-on-2 on the king side, but this should be a theoretical draw. So I think what happened here is because of my reputation for squeezing endgames, being a top player with really good technique, Robbie saw the boogeyman and he thought he would suffer for the next 2 or 3 hours, and instead he wanted to be one of the cool kids like the YouTubers tell you guys to do, and so he sacks the rook on f3, which is simply a mistake. After I take, he takes back with the knight, and on first glance, it looks very scary with these knights. Black has a couple of bastions here, and it feels like black has a lot of play, but in reality, white is simply much better. Because I play f4, he goes d3. Now I go rook to a2, guarding the pawn at a3, and intending to capture the pawn on d3 on the next turn. We get knight g6, I take, he takes, I go rook to b3, we get knight to d5, and here I make a big mistake with this move, knight c3. Now this is a situation where probably I should have played a quiet move like king h2 first, get the king out of any danger zone where there are ideas with like knight checks or like a rook check or anything like that, and then after black plays a move like h6, I can go rook c2 here, and the idea is I still want to play knight c3, I just want to do it with a different construction. Very specifically, if black plays king h7, knight c3, takes, here I take with this rook, and suddenly the rooks are on both the b and the c file, and this should be winning. Whereas in the game, when I play knight c3 here, I thought, okay, I'm trading a set of the knights off, one less knight on the board. The 2 rooks eventually will be more powerful than the rook and the knight. But the problem here is that after the trade in rook a6, now my rooks are not active. The rook on a2 is very passive behind the pawn, and if I ever move it away, I will lose this pawn on a3. So here I go rook to b3, and now Robbie makes a big mistake with king f7. If Robbie had played rook a5 here, guarding this pawn on b5, it's very unclear whether I would have been able to win this game, because probably the simplest way the game would go is something like a4 takes, rook b4, knight d6 takes, and king f7. But I think here in this position, with this knight on f5 being a bastion, the pawns being split on the h and f files, no way to remove this bastion, I think this should technically be a draw. But instead, Robbie goes king f7, which gives me an extra resource, because here after I take on b5, we swap the rooks on a3, but now I have rook c5, and my rook is dominating the horse. Knight simply has only one square to go to, and if black were to just wait, for example, I can just bring my king all the way over here, and eventually I eat this horse on a3, because the knight is simply dominated. So because the knight is dominated, black has to be very careful here. What Robbie does is plays knight b1. Now, I wasn't sure if I was actually winning here, but it's very hard for black to play too, because the simplest idea is to go king e7, but after king f1, king d6, here I can go rook a5. The knight is free now to go to c4, but after rook to a7, I will win one of these pawns on the 7th rank due to the classic kebab, and I should win the game. So Robbie instead plays knight b1. It doesn't help that he's also under a little bit of time pressure. He doesn't have all the time in the world to think, so he goes knight b1. Here I play f3, and once again, the knight is still in very, very bad shape. So Robbie plays knight d2, and now I go rook c3, and again, you'll look at this horse. It simply has no jumps on the board other than to go to the b1 square. So Robbie plays e5, which is pretty much the only move here. If black were to play knight b1 here, for example, now I can go rook to d3. Knight has no squares at all to go to. And after king f6, king f2, king to e5, I can simply go king to, I believe, e2 here. And after king f4, I can go rook to b3. And now I win this knight. Again, no squares available here, and white simply wins the game. So for that reason, in this position, Robbie goes e5, I play king f2, and he plays e4. Desperation time to try and get this knight back to safety. Unfortunately, I don't have to trade the pawns. If I were, after knight takes e4, I lose the game due to the fork. But when I play f4, he has to go knight f3, I go king e3, knight h4, king takes e4, and now we've reached a position where I have rook and 2 pawns versus knight and 2. But beyond that, the knight is actually very, very passive here, and so the rest is very basic. So we get knight g6, I play f5, he goes knight f8, not knight e7, by the way, because after king e5, again, this horse does not have any good squares to jump to. I'll create the kebab on the 7th and win the game in short matter. So We have knight to f8 here. I play h4. He goes king e7. Again, if black were to play knight d7, the kebab is lethal here, because after rook c7, king e7, and king d5, I'm threatening to go king c6 and win the horse. And after king to d8, here I can play king to d6. Let's just say knight f6, rook to a7 here. And after king e8, king to e6, white is simply winning, because if the king goes to d8, I take the pawn on g7. If king f8, I check, and then I go king d7, winning the horse on e8. So Robbie goes king e7, I check, king f6, check, king f7, and now I play h5. Idea very simply that here I want to play h6 and create this passed f-pawn, but also the f-pawn here dominates the horse. It has no jumps. So here we get h6, and now I temporarily sack the pawn with f6, and Robbie goes g6. If he were to play g takes f6 after king to f5 here, white is simply winning. After knight d7, I can play rook to e6 here, and black kind of runs out of moves. If you were to go king g7, I check on e7 and win the knight. If you go knight f8, I take rook a6, followed by rook a7 and king f6, and this is a textbook win. And so we get g6 here. Now, after g6, I just play this very quiet move, rook to a6, and here Robbie Kevlishvili resigns the game simply due to a lack of moves. If black were to play knight e6, I can take on g6 here, and he has to take f6, and then I go g7, winning either the knight or promoting to a queen. And if he plays knight d7, I can go rook a7, pinning the knight. And after king e6, there are many ways to win, but simplest is to sack the rook. And after h takes g6, I just push, go king f5. And with the two connected pawns, this is also a very basic win. Last but not least, after rook a6, if black takes on h5, I go king f5 here. And after h4, I check, king g8, rook g7, king h8, and now I can simply play rook g4. And after h3, there are probably many ways to win, but my intention was to go rook h4, collect the pawn, and then go rook g3 check, check, and then rook back, followed by f7 and rook to e8 here, winning the knight on f8 or getting a queen. So that might have been a very fast explanation, but after rook to a6, it is completely hopeless for black, which is why Robbie Kevlishvili resigns this game. Now, what that means is that I move to 3.5 points out of 4. I don't know if I'm tied for the lead or if there's anybody on 4, but it's a very, very good start. I've won 3 games so far alongside 1 draw, and I'm playing up to expectations. So I'm very happy with today's game. The opening was a little bit shaky, but I still got it done. I played well throughout the game, especially when it mattered in the latter stages, and it's all good. So, on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from round number 4 of the Qatar Masters Open being held here in Doha. Make sure to smash that subscribe button below if you haven't already. And I will be back tomorrow after round number 5's exciting game here in the Qatar Masters Open. See you guys soon.